Hello and welcome to Education Elevated, a podcast from Avenues The World School in New York City. I'm Todd Shy and I'm your host, and I'm head of school at Avenues. Our guest today is Sammy Wright, who taught for 20 years in schools in various parts of England and is currently head of school at a large secondary school there. We're going to talk about his recent book, Exam Nation, which I highly recommend. But I should also point out that Sammy has published a novel called Fit, which won the Northern Book Prize. Sammy, thank you for joining us, and congratulations on Exam Nation, which has been so well received that some of us across the Atlantic have even started hearing about it, and I sat down to read it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been quite exciting.
Yeah, tell me about that. Has anything been surprising for you? I know you've gotten the book's gotten a lot of good attention.
Yeah, I mean, one of the really surprising and very gratifying things actually was um, the way it's been received by different people in different parts of the political spectrum. I mean, I don't know how it is for you guys in America, but certainly in the UK, education gets very, very politicized, and it often gets associated with different pedagogical principles get associated with different political positions. So I got a review on the same day from Michael Gove, who is very much associated with a traditional, um, quite kind of knowledge-rich approach, and from Melissa Ben, who's very much on the left wing. And the idea that both of them were complimenting me on the same day really showed me that maybe I've managed to cut through some of the noise around education.
Yeah, I think the way that you framed the book, well, I think multiple things about the book made it really successful to that end, and we'll talk about them. But the first one to me is you framed the book right from the beginning as a question about what school is for, and which is different from maybe going at it from an analytical point of view, or here's the problems we're going to diagnose, here's the research I'm going to draw on. You take a really big existential question of what are kids in school for? And I thought that was a pivotal and deliberate choice. I wanted to ask you why you framed your book that way right from the start.
I think it's because I suppose there's two different reasons. One, it's because of my training. I'm an English teacher, and as a novelist as well, I often think about story, and I think that the stories we tell are very, very important. And as I get older and I see how politics works and how big organizations work, they always work by storytelling. So I wanted to address the stories that school was telling us, and that was a very kind of that was very much fitting in with my sense of how the world works. But the second thing was maybe a little bit more specific, and it was that I have a real strong sense, based on some of the schools that I've worked in, that kids can be in the same institution and be experiencing very different worlds. Because if you're from a different background and you have different life experiences, then school can be very, very different for you. And I think that we run the risk a lot of the time of simplifying what school does. So I thought by asking that question, what is it for? It seems like a kind of slightly stupid question, slightly simplistic question, but actually the simplicity of it is a way of opening up the true complexity of all the different things that are happening in a school.
Yeah. I thought about, I lingered over that opening for a while because I thought maybe um, one of the ways that we sometimes pose the question is asking what education is for, and that's a very different question from what school is for. And I wondered if I wanted to see if that was a deliberate choice for you too, because I think education is sort of an abstract category that takes us into an analytical mode. School is a living category that takes us into a more of a dynamic personal mode. And I don't know if that was a deliberate choice on your part.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that is, in many ways, I think that one of the biggest problems we have is our confusion between the two things. And the way that I try and express this to people sometimes, and it was the pandemic that really crystallized this a lot in my mind. Um, I ask people sometimes a hypothetical question. If I could take your child and I could fill them with all the education that they needed via a pill, and I could give it to them at the age of 10, would you be happy for them to then leave school? And that, to me, says everything, doesn't it? Because no one says, yeah, that's fine. Because we understand that actually what we want from that period of our children's life is we want the education, but we also want the place for them to grow.
Yeah.
And that's what school is. It is a place that, yes, education is fundamental to what we're doing in it, but it's also a location in which children can move from being children to being adults.
Yeah, there's a Dutch writer, educational philosopher, Gert Biesta, who uses the language of learnification. He says we've gotten into a mode where education has been learnified, so it's all about this sort of the progress of learning, which could be the pill that you're offering, as opposed to that full sort of holistic and existential experience. I think when most people, if I asked the question to most people what school is for, I think most people would give me a pretty straightforward and kind of utilitarian answer. It's what you call transactional. That school is a place of for transactional purposes, and I think they would say it's preparing you for two big things: for more school to get into your next, college
Mhm.
or university. So school's preparing you for more school, and then it's preparing you to be successful down the road in life. And John Dewey, the really influential American philosopher of education, talked about this as mere preparation. Like school is only a place of preparation. And when people talk like that, Sammy, because your book does not talk like that, what are they missing when they think about school that way?
I think, I think there's two things that I would criticize about that kind of viewpoint. One is that, life is for living. Like we are where we are because we want to be there. And, to reduce the most magical period of intellectual expansion in someone's life, which I think is between the ages of, say, 9 and 18, to reduce that to simply preparation for then, punching your card at the workplace seems just reductive and pointless, frankly. It's taking something which can be wonderful and reducing it to something functional. But I think there's also something deeper and more problematic, which is that history is written by the victors. And the problem that we have in the world of education is all of us types who education, like education. We did well.
Right.
We liked school. We got through it. We think, oh, school's great. We valorize that success in school in a way that diminishes the people who don't feel that way. And I think that when we're talking about the idea of preparation for life, um, actually, we ignore the damage that school can do as well. The way it can, take away from how you are in your later life, how it can make you feel lesser as well as more. And I think that, you know, too much of the way we talk about education is how do we design a system that will function well for those in the top 5%?
Yeah.
And we just have never given adequate thought to how we might design a system that would function well for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. And the way that we tend to think about that is through the lens of designing through technique, through we're analyzing what will make school more effective. One of the things that charmed me about your book, and the reason I've been recommending it to people, is that it's the writing itself. So you've already, in some of the answers that you've given, suggested a kind of the need for a bigger imaginative picture of what school is, but your writing is sort of equal to that for me too. I finished your book thinking of schools as a place of intense emotion, of relationship, of community and not just a place of measuring progress. And some of it is I think just the power of your writing. My guess is that it flows from you've written a novel, you studied English, you brought some of that, the life of that to this book. But I'd like you to maybe reflect on that for us a little bit. That the book itself feels like what you're trying to describe school as a place sort of full of life and lift and love and emotion.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I was very, very keen to try and capture that because, um, I think to me that there is I speak as someone who actually in my professional life, because I work in quite a challenging circumstance, I am sometimes very, very seduced by the extreme rigor of, I suppose in America, you talk about the charter school movement and, schools where you kind of like have a hyper controlled environment and, really push a very, very regimented direct instruction type approach. And, I am open to all of that and I can see the successes of it. And I visited schools in the book where I see that approach doing things which are undoubtedly good for the kids in one way. But I also just, um, while I think about that stuff and can engage with it intellectually, as soon as I step into a classroom, I find myself um, at war with myself. I can think of all the ways in which I might want to, make sure they get the maximum in the test.
Right.
And then halfway through the lesson, I'll go off on a tangent and I will do something slightly random because I want to make the kids laugh.
Uh-huh.
And today I was, we were talking about a poem that was all to do with language, and we went into a really interesting digression about um, Irish language hip hop, and we listened to a song, and it was just and that little injection of joy, it's amazing how, as a teacher, if you watch your class and you see, if you'll know yourself, you can watch them and you can watch their responses and you can see the glazed eyes and the glazed eyes and the glazed eyes, and then you just twist.
Yeah.
And you twist something and then they click open and they're there again.
Yeah.
And it's that human dimension which I think we risk at our peril. No matter how efficient we might get in other ways, if we don't have that human dimension, we are really missing the core thing that schools can do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's always frustrated me that writing about education hasn't captured that or embodied that. It's very technical and analytical usually. There's a writer I admire on education, is a professor in Colorado, Martin Bickman, and he says most of what we read about education feels like taxidermy, like we're in a room looking at stuffed animals, and he said it should feel like bird watching, where you're out in the wild with real life and real nature, and you're paying attention to that, and you're enjoying it, and you're doing something with it. I love that contrast. I think that gets it right. Your book is bird watching, and I wanted people to hear just a couple of samples. We'll start with one. Would you mind? Do you have a copy of the book with you?
Yeah, yeah.
Can you go to the bottom of page 89? And what I'd like you to read the the very last paragraph starting with that tension, and then read
Right.
all the way up to the top of 9, read that whole paragraph out for us, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Okay. That tension between the contradictory impulses of teaching, between the pressure to learn content and the opening of space for thought, between the knowledge imparted and the experience felt, between the need to drive for success and the need to scaffold happiness, and between the impulse to control and the impulse to free, seems to me the very heart of the matter. I want to demand rigor and freedom, to say that life is messy and teaching doubly so, to say that challenge and discipline matter, as do cheeky moments when the mask cracks and the teacher swears and the kids giggle. I want to insist that real life sits in real, human, empathic interactions, and that sometimes we need both to draw a line in the sand and to remember that the line is arbitrary.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you for reading that. And it inadvertently references just what you just shared about the anecdote from today in class. And the line's not there ahead of time, is it? The teacher's reading the class constantly to determine which move to make, which time to giggle, and which time to draw kids back, time to be more serious,
Well,
time to go to the Irish rap music, time to stay focused on the like those are hard judgment calls all the time, but you capture it there. Like you're straddling. It's messy, but it's joyful. It's beautiful.
yeah. I mean, the image that I think I used earlier in the book of the way that you also can't predict which things land. I think that's a really fundamental part of why that approach is important because, it is true that time and time again, I've come across instances where I think I've been teaching one thing, and actually you talk to the child later, or you talk to the child as an adult, and you realize that what they receive from what you've given can be quite subtly different from what you tried to transmit.
Yeah, I mean that's when you teach for a long time, as you have, and as I have. One of the joys and humbling things is when you talk to students much later after they've left you and gone on and gone to university or out in the real world, and when they talk about what their experience of your class was like versus what maybe you thought it was, what it was like or what it was about. It's an extraordinarily humbling thing. I think that I do think we try to control education and schools more than is healthy. There's a book I really like. So when I was finishing your book, I was starting a book called The Uncontrollability of the World by a German sociologist. You would like this book. His name is Hartmut Rosa, Rosa. And he's not writing about, he does briefly talk about school, but he says, look, the modern world is organized and structured around some key principles that are efficiency, growth, measurement, optimization, control. And he says that that frame works for some things, but it doesn't work for everything. And we get into trouble when we apply that kind of frame to things that require something else. And his word for what that something else is really beautiful, Sammy. He says that part of our experience we should think of in terms of resonance. And resonance for him is something in the world is sort of acts on you. You don't control it or manipulate it, but it comes to you and it transforms you. It resonates with you. And I thought I was finishing your book and I was starting his, and I thought, well, that school is the first place where that really happens for kids, is they begin to encounter things that are coming to them and that you're not entirely controlling or scripting. And it seemed to me a beautiful balance to some of the ways that we insist on schools having clarity of purpose and then clarity of outcomes. And you and the Hartmut Rose is like, well, there's some things you could organize that way, and some things not. I wonder what you make of that framing.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And it links in to me with the idea that, um, that we have to be very careful of um, claims of precision when no precision can exist.
Great.
And in that's you'd come back to that kind of central question of exams and assessment. One of the things that um, we have kind of allowed ourselves to be seduced into is the idea that it is possible to put a number on achievement.
Yeah.
When actually all we're doing is, we have this phrase in quite a useful phrase in education in the UK, which is we talk about poor proxies for learning.
Uh,
Certain things you can use. It's like, is a class quiet?
yeah.
Well, you can use that as a proxy for learning, but it's not a very good one.
Yeah.
All right. And if we think in terms of assessment, we can say, in English assessment, it's a particularly tricky thing. We can say, here are 15 qualities that we might see in wonderful writing. Varied use of punctuation, different paragraph sizes, use of complex clauses. We might say all of those, and yet you put them all together and you don't have good writing. And, more than that, you have two examples next to each other using different combinations. And there's no meaningful way of saying X is better than Y.
Right.
And I think that what we need to be very open to is the possibility that we just can't say.
Yeah.
And that maybe it's much more meaningful to talk in terms of, have we reached a threshold where we can do X task, rather than in a fine-grained way, 764 is a higher mark in your SATs than 763.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And because I did go back to your earlier image of the pill, that if you could give it to somebody and you've learned everything you need to in a pill, you swallow it when you're 10, you don't need to do school. It's almost what you're describing is the assumption that if we get all the ingredients right, precisely right, then you achieve the goal.
Well,
But it's not a recipe like that. It's not an accumulation of ingredients, because well, why not? Why is that? Why is that misleading?
I think because, I think I keep on saying there's two of everything, isn't there? Now, the reason it's misleading on the most fundamental level is because the components of learning don't exist in isolation. And so, there's been a lot of effort to codify learning and codify knowledge and say, here are the units of knowledge that we might build up into a bigger kind of schema, et cetera, et cetera. But that isn't actually how it works if you start thinking about it at all. Because, say, for example, if we're talking about, let's take maths, all right? So you've got a series of, transactions in maths that you might learn, all right? So multiplications, subtractions, divisions, etc. And you might learn how to do each of those, but you can learn them in different ways. So, for example, someone might learn their multiplications by learning their times tables. And that's one type of learning that unit of knowledge. Someone else might learn them by learning the actual process of multiplying. And that's a different kind of learning, but you end up with the same product. Now, if you've got the first one, you can go much quicker when you're doing various different kinds of quick sums. But if you've got the second one, you've got a more conceptual understanding. And those two types of learning work in different ways. And actually what you want is you want the two of them to mesh. Now, that's just a tiny example of it, but it's just an illustration of the fact that we mustn't be seduced by the easy idea of unit of knowledge, right? Because once you get into, more complex things like, for example, how well do I know Macbeth? That is just irreducible. But then, we can go a little bit further than that as well, because there is this kind of wider sense in which, when we're talking about, hang on, I'm just going to pause and refresh my ideas there. So you might have to just cut that for a minute. So remind me of the original point of the question.
We were talking about precision and, why this mania to turn everything into this precise ingredient list?
Yeah. So, yeah. Okay, I had an idea, but I don't know where it's going. It'll come back at some point. Anyway, but yes.
Yeah, and every student is as complex as the human spirit is, and we're trying to get to know each kid at the level of where they are in order to mobilize them to where they're going to go next. And it's with every student, it's hard and complex and beautiful.
But yeah. Sorry, I just remembered where I was going. Yeah, so from that before it slips living. So the other thing I wanted to say about this idea of kind of like trying to nail people down, nail their ability down, and define it, is I think that there is a problem in our world at the moment, which is about scale. And I think it's something that we don't think about often enough. And essentially what I mean is this, is if we've got, a society of a few hundred or a few thousand people, it can be meaningful to say Bob is better than Janice at this activity, because you can look at Bob and Janice and they're different people. You go, okay, yeah, of the people I've got available, Bob's best for doing this, Janice is best for doing that. So that kind of ranking and that kind of assessment is meaningful. But when you have a potential pool of millions, billions, if you have 70,000 Bobs, then the difference between them becomes less and less meaningful. And it means that, you know, any attempt to rank becomes finer and finer grained, and therefore with less and less justification to it. So I think there's, a really good description of this is actually Michael Sandel when he talks about entrance into Harvard. So, he says that actually in the way that the modern world works, now you have so many kids applying for Harvard who are perfectly capable of studying there. Right. It becomes less and less meaningful to actually take the ones with the top grades.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. They could fill the class multiple times over with perfect test scores and straight A transcripts. Sammy, can we, one of the other beautiful things you do in your book, I think, is to widen our gaze to think about schools as communities. You referenced this earlier. There's a phrase that you use. I want to quote, and then I want to talk about schools as communities. Um, we have a concept of childhood, you write, but and then this is the quote from the book. It depends on there being an environment in which childhood can take place. And I stopped over that phrase. I thought that was a lovely way of turning a description of school around for us a little bit. So you think of school as a place of learning, as a place of socialization, but an environment for childhood to just take place. It's an unexpected and lovely description of school, and it pushes against. I think what your book is trying to do over and over is to push us away from thinking of school as a place of transactions, but a place of both of growth, but that its embeddedness in a community. Could you talk more about that? Why you put that description in, or how you're thinking about school as community?
Yeah, I find this so important nowadays. I think it's always been important to me, but I think I recognize something which has always been true, which is that many of the children that I teach come from backgrounds and environments where home isn't always safe. And the places that they are outside school are not always nurturing. And I think anyone who's worked in schools will recognize those kids who come back after the holidays with a look of relief in their eyes. And I think that we need to pay attention to those kids because they really matter. And a society that does well by those children is a society that has a moral core, in my view. Um, but I think there's also something more recent. And, um, you know, anyone who is in any way engaged with current politics probably has a concern around social media, around atomization, polarization of discourse. And again, I'm sure, the recent book by Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation, I'm sure that's been as widely discussed in America as it has in the UK. Um, all of which kind of points towards this idea that we're living in a time where the norms of society are changing. And, we shop online, we communicate online, we don't have the same kind of uh, public space that we used to. And yet the place that remains, the place that has not changed is school. So I think that, for many children, I think it used to be the case that you would talk about this only in terms of the most deprived children. But nowadays, I feel like even children from very well off, well regulated homes when they're not in school, a lot of their life is online.
Yeah.
And so school becomes the place where they can actually be a child in a much more traditional sense and where they can understand that kind of interaction.
Uh, I'm going to ask you if you would to read another. I mean, I'd love to just sit here and read out quotations from the book so people got a sense of how wonderfully rich the writing is. But let's do it. Let's do one more. Would you mind going to page 140? And I mean, what you just talked about and what you do so well over and over is, I think, make vivid the humanity of what education is and what being a teacher is and what school is. The humanness of it should be written about more. So I want you to read out another example of where I think you do that well. So the penultimate paragraph, the second one from the bottom beginning in this book, if you could just read out that whole paragraph, please.
In this book, I sometimes try to use the proper terminology and call them pupils or students. But most of the time, I find myself reverting to kids because that is how I see them. They are children and they live with us in our school for half of their lives. It's easy to criticize things like problems from the outside, but when it's your kids, your pupils, you don't see that. You see simply the sheer exhilaration of being 16 and having your whole life ahead of you.
Yeah. I mean, the sheer exhilaration of being 16 and having your whole life ahead of you. I think that, Sammy, when I used to tell people I was a teacher, so now I'm in a like an administrative seat, and I'm not in the classroom as much as I used to be, but I used to tell people I was a teacher, and people would get kind of like people would put their hands up and say, "Boy, I could never do that." The idea of being around 16-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds just intimidates a lot of people. But the word you use is exhilaration. Like you're witnessing something exhilarating in that age group. It's not what people usually associate with it. But it's one of the things I appreciated in your book is there's a little bit of, um, there's some rapture in the experience of teaching and being around students who are coming of age. And as you say, they've got their whole life in front of them and they're just beginning to see that.
Mm. Yeah, I find it um, absolutely magical, to be honest. And I have certain, um, I spend a lot of time because of the nature of the school system in the UK. At the moment, a lot of my attention gets focused on our year 11s. That's the 15, 16-year-olds because they're doing their main exams now. It means that I talk throughout that year, I talk to students again and again. And it's lovely because, one of the things I add to again and again in the book is the idea of storytelling and teaching and storytelling. And I've done it often enough now that I kind of sow my seeds at the start of the year and I say various things. And then as I go through the year and I see them, once a week in assembly or in their lessons and so on as I go around, I can feel the narrative building. And there's certain things that I know if I say to the naughtiest girl at age of 14, I'll sit them down and I'll say, the thing about this is it's going to go in one of two ways. You're either going to figure things out or you're not. And then you look to the guy and you say, and I think you're going to figure it out. And you're making a little bet to yourself. And then you kind of collect on that bet 2 years later and you get the chance to actually say to them, remember, I said you would. I might not have been quite as certain as it seemed, but they feel that I've believed in them. And that is just brilliant, that, because you just see their faces light up.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the secret weapon of a teacher, of believing in a kid. The language I use sometimes with my faculty is claiming kids. Like you say to the kid, like, I see you and we're gonna do something interesting together and you're going to like keep growing and moving and I'm claiming you. Like you're not gonna disappear in here. Uh, yeah, your book was out. Some of my colleagues knew I was gonna talk to you and they said, what's the book about? And I paused for a minute because it's about a lot of things. And I said, well, let me give you this shorthand that I think captures a lot. And you put it this way, but I think this is a nice takeaway from the book. Schools are communities and teachers are storytellers.
Yeah.
That's a nice framing, I think, to remind us, because it's a little bit unexpected, because you don't, in that framing, nowhere in there are learning outcomes, which we know we're also doing and advancing. But the community school, the storyteller, the teacher is a nice framework.
And I think the thing that's nice about that as well, the way you put it, is that it's perfectly compatible with the learning process
Right.
too, you know,
Right.
because that kind of that drier stuff is still a kind of storytelling.
Yeah.
A scheme of learnings is a story in its own right. It's just
That's
that
right.
you have remember to be entirely dry about it.
That's right. I used to tell the teachers that I supervised, I used to ask them, "What's the story of your course this year?" Like the year journey with the students, and you've got 13-year-olds in your English class. What's the story of the year for them? What's the story of the course you're taught? It's a healthy way, I think, of moving us from the transactional, the fear of the transactional approach that we began with. Let's talk about one of your former students. I really enjoyed this anecdote. You were watching the television, saw one of your students on TV. And I want to read out what you said about the student and about school, and then ask you to elaborate. So I'll read this one. Your student's name is Kingsley. You write, hearing Kingsley talk makes me remember the department and the sense of mission and purpose there was. Not to get the grades necessarily, although that was part of it, but to transmit a proper love of the texts. It really was that simple. We wanted them to love the topics we taught, and we showed love to them too. And I love that, Sammy. I'm gonna give you a chance to elaborate, and then maybe I'll offer why I found it so moving.
So, I, I think people come into teaching in different ways, and I think for me, I approached it, you know, uh, as you said at the start, I write fictional stuff, and all my life I wanted to be a writer. All my life I love literature, and I went into teaching mainly because it was a way of continuing to read in lots of ways. And what I found, you know, I find writing very fulfilling, but I actually don't find it more fulfilling than teaching about writing. And, so I can have a reader who reads my novel and kind of comes away and goes, that was fantastic. And I feel really good about myself, and that's great. But I don't feel better about that than I do when I manage to teach a poem really, really well to a kid. Because I feel if I'm teaching a poem really, really well to a kid, I'm giving them literature that is the best literature. Mine's good. I mean, I like it. But I'm not, I'm not Wordsworth. And to me, it's a real privilege. I feel like I kind of piggyback on those people. So there are kids who love Hamlet because of me, and they hear my voice when they read Hamlet. Well, that is special. That
It is, but they also know, I mean, everything I could tell about you as a teacher from your book is they know you love them too. So this balance between I so years ago, I started getting frustrated when I would tell people I'm a teacher, and the response was what I said a few minutes ago. It was like, "Hey, good for you. I could never do that." You know, uh, thanks for taking one for the team. And I started, instead of asking them, questions about that, I started saying, "Hey, tell me about a teacher that you had that was really formative." And then people would light up. I mean, they couldn't be more enthusiastic and grateful and reverent and generous, and I started paying attention to that. And so I asked people over to tell me about a teacher, and it was always one of those two things. So I think you got it exactly right. It's this simple. We wanted them to love the topics we taught. So the teachers who have an impact on us loves the thing they're teaching and offering, but they showed love to us too. You feel connected and loved and seen. And I do think that's what teaching boils down to.
Yeah, well, and the thing with it, love is an interesting word. It's actually a word I try and use in school quite often. So, when I talk to the kids about why we're doing things that we're doing and, what they might want in their future, I do try and say, I think we need to say what do I want for your future? I hope everyone in this room finds love.
Yeah.
And it's quite a difficult thing to say sometimes. Um, and yet it's really, really important because I think that otherwise, particularly say, for example, with some of the things we hear about young men who feel very isolated and feel unable to talk about their feelings, and young women who feel very negative about themselves. To actually open up that discussion that there is that love is a thing. It's not just something you see in books.
Yeah.
It's something that can be in the room with you as well.
Yeah.
It's quite important.
And yeah, what does that look like because I agree. I was a classroom teacher for 20 years before I moved into other roles. You experience that, you feel that. It's an intensely unscriptedly emotional experience to be with a group of kids for a year
Yeah.
like that. And love does come into it.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, and I think I think what you have to do, but it's a really tricky thing as well because obviously what you have to do is you have to, you know, that there's an emotional maturity and wisdom that you have to apply as well.
Right.
You have to kind of like I'm always very careful with my students to simultaneously try and build that bond, but also not over-identify it.
That's right.
You also see that as well. And
That's right.
I've seen teachers in my time who create a kind of passionate bond with their kids, and you realize that it's become more about the teacher than it has about the child.
Yeah.
There is a kind of, there's a sweet spot where you're offering that out there, you're showing them that you care, you're paying attention, but you're not demanding anything of them in
Right.
return.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really nice balance of that. Um, so here's, I'm going to, the line I wanted to read next is so simple, but in some ways I think is the headline of the book, or it's the headline of the book for me. It comes late. Um, and it says this. This is so simple. The experience of learning matters. The experience of learning matters. But that's so simple, but it was jolting to me because, again, usually we think the outcomes of learning matters, the success, the accomplishment, that what you're trying to do is to take that pill that maybe this is the right critique of that image of if you could just take the pill and have all the learning, you miss the experience. But it's a great line. I was going to invite you to comment on it. The experience of learning matters.
I think, I've talked so many times about in this conversation about, literature and my experience as a teacher of English. And that is because it's inevitably part of the way I see education. But it's also a very good illustration of this particular point because, you know, I have again and again, I sit in a classroom and my students are preparing for an exam in which they've got 15 poems that they need to know. And over the years, what I've seen is that they prepare by annotating the poem furiously until they can't see the words in the poem, and then going back and reading their annotations and copying them down on another piece of paper, and then ending up with a summary of the poem and then checking on the internet. And they end up with all this stuff that's not the poem. Well, I'm gonna go. So all I do is I just every lesson, they're constantly wanting to reach for their books and their annotations. I just give them a fresh copy and say, read it. And I make them read it again, annotate it afresh. Because the reading of the poem is the thing that matters.
Right.
Um, you know, like it's I'm going to get very, very highbrow here for a minute, because actually a lot of this thinking for me, I bring right back to some kind of core philosophical ideas that I think I read when I was quite young. They just really stuck in my mind. And I call it, I think a lot of this stuff comes from Hindu scriptures and Buddhist scriptures, and in particular the Bhagavad Gita, where they talk about the difference between the outcome of actions, the fruit of actions, and the actions themselves. And essentially, the point is so simple and so important, which is that if we think about outcome, we are thinking about death. That's what outcome is. Outcome is the end of something. No one wants the end of something. We all want to live in the process of something. So if learning simply becomes about getting to a finish line, it's sterile. Learning has to be about process, because life is process. And that I actually, and this again is maybe me being slightly inappropriate in the classroom. I quite often say to my classes, "You're all going to die," because it's just such a powerful thing to sit there and go, "No, we have to face this. We have to recognize that life is finite, and this is what we have, and this is where we are in this world." And the phrase I then use is from Solon, and it's, "No one can be judged happy until they're dead." All right. If you want to know what the final outcomes of stuff, you've got to wait to the end. But in the meantime, get stuck into the process.
Yeah, yeah, that's nice. Well, Sammy, we like to end our discussions by talking about formative teachers and celebrating formative teachers. I wonder if you'd like to just share a particular teacher who had an impact on you, and maybe I'll test your thesis that they either loved what they were teaching or showed love to you. But tell us about a formative teacher.
Yeah. So I'll tell you about Mr. Marsh, because he actually sadly died this summer. And I was in touch with several teachers because of the book. And it was really nice that they got back in touch with me. And so I was able to give a comment for his memorial service. And the thing about it was that I remember he was an English teacher, and there are several phrases and things that he did that I have then used throughout my entire career. And in particular, the thing I remember is when he was teaching Macbeth to me, he took such glee in describing how unpleasant it was to be killing swine. And he would talk about how you'd slit the throat of the pig and the blood would be all over the coals, swirling everywhere. And it was this kind of just delight in the grotesqueness of what he was saying. I think just really touched something in me.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, yeah. Teachers delighting in what they're teaching is, but that's the formula for delight in students for sure. Well, Sammy, I think your book is important and so thoughtful. I'm recommending it. I'll spread the word over on this side of the pond. It's eloquent. It's really beautifully written, and that image of Martin Bickman's that I referred to earlier really stands out to me. That the difference between taxidermy and bird watching. Your book is very much bird watching. It's full of flight and life, and I'm so grateful you wrote it. I'm grateful to have read it, and I'm grateful that you joined us today to talk with us on Education Elevated. So thank you. If you come to New York at any time, I hope you'll look us up and come by. I'd love to see you here. But in the meantime, good luck with the book and with everything else. And thank you for being with us today.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure.